let's look at the rational and the empirical aspects of ethics in Immanuel Kant. We're still looking at the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. As a necessary prerequisite to isolating the given in ethics, to distinguish a specifically ethical given and purify it of any non-ethical ingredients in moral reasoning, Kant further articulates a division between rational and empirical aspects of ethics. He argues that the proper subject matter of logic has no empirical aspect, but is purely rational because it has to do with universal and the necessary laws of thought. In contrast with logic, Kant asserts that ethics has both an empirical and non-empirical component. Were it not for the fact that morality, like natural philosophy, has both an empirical and non-empirical side, there could be a difficulty in distinguishing ethics from logic. More significantly, there would be no problem distinguishing between ethics and physics, and no need to purify ethics of empirical elements in order to arrive at the given in ethics. Let's read the succeeding paragraph, which I now put in highlighted. Logic can have no empirical part, that is, no part in which the universal and necessary laws of thinking would rest on grounds taken from experience. For in that case, it would not be logic, that is, a canon for the understanding or for reason, which holds for all thinking and which must be demonstrated. On the other hand, natural as well as moral philosophy can each have its empirical part, since the former must determine laws of nature as an object of experience, the latter, laws of the human being's will, insofar as it is affected by nature. The first as laws in accordance with which everything happens, the second as laws in accordance with which everything ought to happen, while still taking into account the conditions under which it very often does not happen. Kant's reference to the exact role for empirical considerations in ethics, determining the human will insofar as it is affected by nature, makes it clear that he recognizes the psychological dimension of ethical judgment. We, as willful moral thinkers, are determined in various ways by psychological factors, including our empirical psychological natures and the impact of environment. These influences, in turn, depend on social interactions with others and the way in which these influences shape our desires, inclinations, and ultimately our moral values, decisions, and actions. All these, Kant says, is an inextricable part of our moral lives, and hence an inextricable part of ethics. In particular, it is the empirical part of ethics that must be distinguished from its rational part. Kant distinguishes between the rational and the empirical elements of ethics, bringing ethics into the same orbit as physics, and separating both methodologically from logic as formal science. Let's read the next paragraph. All philosophy, insofar as it is founded on, as it is based on grounds of experience, can be called empirical. But insofar as it sets forth its teaching simply from a priori principles, it can be called pure philosophy. When the latter is merely formal, it is called logic. But if it is limited to determinate objects of understanding, it is called metaphysics. Physics and ethics, still talking about the three sciences that was mentioned at the introduction and is bold in this copy, preface, sorry, each require a specific metaphysics. The empirical element of ethics Kant refers to as practical philosophy, anthropology, emphasizing its empirical nature as a study of human behavior. As practical anthropology, the empirical component of morals in Kant's theory is directed towards the human moral condition, including ethical activity, inclination, and proclivities. Let's read the succeeding paragraph. In this way, there arises the idea of a twofold metaphysics. Dalawa, a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals. Physics will therefore have its empirical part, but it will also have a rational part. So too will ethics. Though here the empirical part of ethics might be given the special name practical anthropology, while the rational part might properly be called morals. Kant nevertheless believes that morality transcends human limitations. What other subjects of moral reasoning other than human beings could there possibly be? How can there be a purely rational aspect of morality to be distinguished from the empirical side of practical anthropology? Elsewhere, Kant mentions the moral requirements of a purely rational ethical theory that would need to apply to angels as well as to human beings. In more contemporary terms, we might imagine that the correct moral theory should not be confined exclusively to principles based on human psychology if there could be extraterrestrial aliens who would also be bound by appropriate moral laws. The point is that we cannot assume a correct theory of ethics will apply only to human agents. The principles of pure moral philosophy, in Kant's conception, should therefore not depend on the empirical facts of human psychology. An angel or an extraterrestrial might not have anything relevantly like a human psychological makeup, but might, for example, be incapable of pleasure and pain, lack human emotions of compassion, envy, greed, or the like. What then would human, angelic, and alien moral agents all have in common, by virtue of which their behavior is governed by moral law? Kant's answer, in every case, is their ability to reason. For it is only by virtue of rationality that moral agents can be subject to principles of any kind, including the principles of ethical conduct and moral philosophy. We do not attribute moral responsibility to inanimate objects or to non-human terrestrial animals insofar as they are unable to reason. When we consider rational non-human beings, on the other hand, we expect, if we ever directly encounter them, that in their actions, they will be subject to the same moral principles that govern human moral conduct. Since such creatures, by hypothesis, need not have anything resembling a human psychology, aside from being rational agents, the principles of a correct moral theory must also be predicated exclusively on reason, eliminating reference to any other aspect of specifically human psychology. If Kant is right, then reason is both necessary and sufficient for an agent to be subject to the moral law. Kant specifically argues that ethics, just like physics, is supported by a special kind of metaphysics. The metaphysics of natural science and the metaphysics of ethics, in Kant's terminology, must be purified of empirical elements in order to determine the applicable range of moral principles. Kant marks the distinction between those who he will call all moralists versus those that he will call, sorry, I'm looking for the text. Those who would say have a calling to there, whether this is going to be a case of all teachers of morals whose name is Legion, or by some who feel a calling to it. There. The difference between the two, let me put that on highlight, all teachers of morals and those who have a calling for it, emphasizes the full generality that Kant maintains must hold true or must hold for true moral principles versus the inclinations of a limited number of persons who, by virtue of their psychologies, are inclined to live their lives according to prescribed moral rules. The idea is that even persons who through lives according to prescribed moral, who lives their lives according to prescribed moral rules, the idea is that even persons who through accidents of psychology are not inclined to accept moral precepts, but are outside the circle of the moral involvement, should still be regarded as subject to the moral law. Kant makes this case for the need to identify the underlying metaphysical principles of empirical physics and practical anthropology or empirical ethics when he asks, and I'll begin here. Here, however, I ask only whether the nature of science does not require that the empirical part always be carefully separated from the rational part, and that the metaphysics of nature be put before physics proper, and a metaphysics of morals before practical anthropology, with metaphysics carefully cleansed of everything empirical, so that we may know how much pure reason can accomplish in both cases, and from what sources it draws these a priori teaching of its own. Whether the latter job be carried on by all teachers of morals whose name is Legion, as I recited a while ago, or only by some who feels a calling to it. An essential preliminary, Kant argues, that the metaphysics of morals is altogether non-empirical. The physics or the metaphysics of morals as a discipline must correspondingly be freed of all empirical elements. From the standpoint of modern philosophical opposition between reason and experience, rationalism and empiricism, Kant proposes to eliminate all empirical elements from ethical thinking, which he describes as practical cognition, to concentrate only on what is purely moral. This in turn turns out to saying the rational part of ethics. Kant recognizes the empirical component of ethics as indispensable to its practical applications, making its principles available to human decision making. He further identifies such practical reasoning in ethics as a power of judgment sharpened by experience. A power of judgment sharpened by experience. A complete and correct moral theory must finally integrate rational and empirical elements for sure. Here, practical cognitions, as we've said a while ago. The rational foundation, therefore, of ethics, the groundwork of morals, Kant asserts, in order to constitute the metaphysics of morals, by analogy again with the metaphysics of physical science, must be purified of all empirical elements so as to provide a foundation for the practical, empirical superstructure. Let's look for that here. Let me put that in bold. Thus, among practical cognitions, not only do moral laws, along with their principles, differ essentially from all the rest, in which there is something empirical, but all moral philosophy is based entirely on its pure part. And when it is applied to the human being, it does not borrow the listing from acquaintance with him, that is from anthropology, but gives to him, as a rational being, laws a priori, which no doubt still requires there a judgment sharpened by experience. That's a very important idea there. A judgment sharpened by experience, partly to distinguish in what cases they are applicable, and partly to provide them with access to the will of the human being and efficacy for his fulfillment of them. For the human being is affected by so many inclinations that, though capable of the idea of a practical pure reason, is not so easily able to make it effective in concreto in the conduct of his life. Thus, Kant distinguishes between the abstract theory of ethics and the practical applications of moral principles. He defines the abstract theory as the metaphysics of morals, which he requires to be purified of all the empirical elements as a purely rational discipline. The practical application of moral principles evidently involves a relation to the empirical psychology of human moral agents, and in particular, to their free will. to their will, desires, inclinations, by which they are and we are motivated to act. Although reason must be combined with emotion and will in a complete moral philosophy, just as they must in a complete human moral agent, the metaphysics of morals, according to Kant, must be purely rational. Kant's method of purifying ethics of its empirical components is to identify a purely rational principle or set of principles to explain moral decision making in general terms that do not appeal to any empirical facts about the moral psychology of human agents. The principles of moral judgment that he is prepared to invoke must therefore be evaluated from a standpoint of pure reason as contributions to pure moral philosophy. The informal test of whether Kant has succeeded in articulating the grounding of the metaphysics of morals is whether the moral law he prescribes would be just as applicable to non-humans as to human moral agents. We can judge the effectiveness of Kant's moral theory in Kant's own terms by this standard, asking whether at any stage Kant's principles would apply only to human beings with their particular type of moral psychology, human will, and emotions, or whether the same principles hold to the extent that they do to any rational agents, regardless of their biology or psychology or in their independently empirical experience. If you like this type of content, please click like and subscribe to Samo't sa Simula. Maraming salamat po.